Welcome back to Beulah Disc Golf Course as we discuss course design again. My name is Tim Anderson and I'm the head number cruncher here. Today we are discussing score separation, which is a phrase that you hear quite often in the sport, but we're going to take it a step forward, a large step forward. I think when talking about course design, this may be the most important topic aside from the obvious things like safety and liability. First off, score separation is what occurs when people play a hole and get different results, depending on both skill level and how they fared on any given attempt. A hole with poor score separation might result in a division or class of player getting 80% pars, 10% birdies, and the rest bogey and above. As a tournament progresses, you would prefer the players separating from each other in their scores, and 80% pars isn't going to do that. That hole needs adjusting, and as stated in the first video, it still might be a good and usable hole for other reasons, but a great hole meets more of these criteria. Good score separation on a hole might be better with 33% birdie, 33% par, and 33% bogey and up. That leaves 1% for eagle.
What up?
With a course full of these kind of holes, you'll really start seeing more movement. But is it movement for movement's sake? Here's the big issue that needs to be addressed, and I have yet to hear anyone talk about it, and if so, I wish I had heard about it before now and given you some credit. What we really need on our courses is player total score separation. What's the difference? In the first video, I talked about randomness and how it needs to be minimized. If there are a ton of random elements on a hole, like arbitrary or excessive OB stakes on the fairway, or a basket that sits on a knob with 60-foot runaway slopes in every direction, then you've gotten some score separation from random elements instead of good course design. And if your entire course is full of these elements, you'll have less player total score separation. Basically, random bad luck will hit everyone, including the top player who is throwing incredibly well. In fact, this bad luck will shut down the top player's hot streak. On a well-designed course with less randomness, that hot player will not lose those strokes, and as a result, soar ahead like he or she should. How many times have you heard an announcer on coverage talk about how lucky or unlucky a player has been in a round? We'd rather hear less about luck and more about skill, wouldn't we? One thing that is often commented on is how bunched up players have been at the end of a round or the week. When a player cruises ahead and wins by 5 strokes, we take note. What has unfortunately become the norm is a large group of players tied for many spots all the way down the line. In my volleyball days, my coach would say to me, "Serve up the hot hand." This meant set the ball to who was hitting really well. In our disc golf tournaments, we want to see the hot hand cruising ahead of the rest of the field. Ricky Wysocki talks a lot about momentum and how important he thinks it is for players that have gotten to the lead card. It's basic sport psychology. The sad thing that happens is that poor design frustrates the player and shuts down the momentum. Random bad luck won't shut down momentum nearly as fast as bad design, because that bad design is something that they see as something that should have been avoided. In the end, whether it's the fault of overambitious design elements or not, we are increasingly hearing players say that they played really well, but sadly their scores don't reflect it. Our goal is to minimize this. We won't be able to eliminate it, of course. I mean, we are launching a spinning wing into the wind. How about we take a look once more at ball golf? Yes, we shouldn't try to copy them in all things, but we should look at all sports and borrow what we can to better ourselves, especially those that have been around for a very long time and have learned a few lessons already. Ball golf has far, far less random elements than disc golf. You don't often use a lot of touch for most of your clubs until you get to your wedges and putters. For the most part, it's a two-dimensional sport. I haven't played since I was 45 for medical reasons, but I knew that even then, at that age, if I pulled out my 6-iron, it would go 205 yards. Sure, I could affect it a bit and fade it right or draw it left, hit a knockdown shot, but for all practical purposes, it was a two-dimensional shot. If I needed 10 more yards, that's a 5-iron. If there's a tree in my way, it's probably because I'm off the fairway and I have to hit something unconventional, or more likely take my lumps and put it back in play. There's not a lot of randomness in ball golf. The wind affects it in a fairly predictable way. Here in Colorado, the altitude means I get 9% more distance. Being in the rough means less backspin when hitting it at the green, which makes the ball release and go off the back. It's fairly predictable. As a result, the hot player is most likely going to win. In disc golf, our sport is already inherently more random. Wind affects the disc much more, and wind isn't constant. I mentioned altitude, and that affects each disc profile differently. Did you know that airport runways in Colorado are 25% longer than those at sea level? It takes more airspeed to generate lift up here since there's less air, and a disc with more dome will require even more speed to fly, like it did at sea level. Ballistic, low-profile discs fly more similar to how they do at sea level. When the world distance record was set with a Phoenix by Sam Ferrins in '88, everyone had to give it a try. It has an enormous dome, and I, as well as others, could never get it to fly up here in Colorado. But it flies great at lower altitude. Another big change is your putter drops up here. Just traveling from state to state changes things a ton, and from disc to disc. Where ball golf just changes things a percentage. Balls do break towards the mountains, though, on greens, but that's a whole different story. Disc golf is played in the woods a ton, and a 10-foot errant shot might get you a kick back towards the fairway, while an 11-foot shank will kick you into the bog of eternal stench. So why should we be adding a bunch of extra randomness? If we can bring it down, we'll increase the player total score separation, as opposed to just score movement. We want tougher courses, so don't hear any of this as a plea for making things easier. Just more fair and consistent. Here's some other examples of random elements. Excessive use of elevated baskets. Think hard about what that does before judging whether or not that's a good or bad thing. I like the slightly elevated ones on tour, but any higher and you get to a point of diminishing returns. But we'll talk about baskets in the video about greens and basket placement. What about those koozies under the basket? Do they cause too many rollaways? What if they were filled with something that absorbed a hit like gel or sand instead of springy foam? What about those large black trash can looking bases? We've seen plenty of rollaways from those. What about tree stumps in the fairway? Fine in the rough, but get them out of the fairway, don't you think? How about this magical tool? A pole saw can make things both look and play great. Branches in the trees just off the fairway actually will prevent a bad shot from going into the rough. So cleaning up the dead ones in the immediate area is a good idea. And what about all that brush we're creating? Call it the Craigslist rental plan. Buy a used chipper if you can afford it, and sell it in a couple years. You are going to be the best judge of what is a random element on your course. It just takes a little time and being cognizant of what's going on around you as people play. I used to have a hole here that had a basket halfway down a fairly steep slope, which was 120 feet from top to bottom. People loved the hole, but it was treacherous at the same time. It was that hole. I nixed it, and it was really tough because it was iconic. You even threw over the stream to get there. But I knew it had to go. There were several holes here that I hated to see go when redesigning, but you gotta make tough choices all the time when laying stuff out. Here's another topic to touch on. What is the toughest hole in the course? If you're watching coverage, they will rate it as compared to par. But is it really the toughest to birdie, or the one with the most score separation? Yes, this is another trap. Setting the par on a hole isn't really that relevant, as par is just a number. And what is too hard? I'm watching a tournament online at the moment, and there's talk about a new hole and how it's the hardest hole in the course now. It's the hardest hole to get a birdie on, but does that really make it the hardest hole? If only one person gets a birdie on it, then maybe it should be thought of as a par 5 instead of a par 4. And now if that's the case, is the score separation good? Or did most people come up with just 2 scores instead of the birdie, par, and bogey we're looking for? I think the toughest hole in the course is the one that has the biggest separation without too many random elements. Did people take the risky shot over the safe shot more often and repeatedly pay for it? That's exciting golf, both from a player and spectator stance. So back to the topic. How do we achieve card separation as opposed to just score separation on a hole-by-hole basis? Statistics like StatMando can show you a lot. Read every bit of information and ask yourself, what does this say about my course, or this hole? Another is by analyzing tournament results. What's the score spread? What are people saying? Without tournaments here yet, I do it by watching good players when they visit. Watch closely to see what causes people to miss birdies and to get bogeys. I've walked with a ton of people here, and most of the time I just watched, not taking discs to throw at all. Become a student of your course. A popular saying these days is, don't overthink it. Not in this case. You should overthink it. This goes back to the first video and going from good to great. Put in the effort. Let's have more great. And just a reminder, this course you're seeing is at a retreat center in the mountains of southern Colorado, and we're doing a crowdfunding campaign to equip the course with a full set of good baskets, concrete tees, and tee signs. If you click on the pinned comment below, you can see the status of that. The cool thing about our campaign is, for donors of $500 and up, they can come stay at the retreat here with us for a few days or more and play some disc golf. Of course, we need small donations as well, so thanks for checking it out. The next video should be a fun one if you enjoy things that make people argue. We'll be looking at OB usage in fairways. I'll be sure to read those comments right before going to bed so I can get a good night's sleep. See you then.